Hello and welcome to Module 4 of Writing Task 1. Today we're going to look at planning, structure, and identifying key features. So let's look at what we're going to do in this module in a little bit more detail. We're going to look at why we should plan. Lots of people don't plan, so I'm going to convince you why planning is a good idea. I'm going to show you a step-by-step system for planning. And then I'm going to show you a simple 4-paragraph structure that I use for all of my Task 1 essays. Then we're going to look at something very, very important, how to identify key features. This is something that most students don't do very well, but it's one of the most important things. We're going to look at examples of lots of different questions, and we're going to use those examples to help us identify the key features and learn how to identify the key features. And then we're going to look at some key lessons that we learned by looking at all the examples. So it's a very long lesson, so have a coffee or a cup of tea, get your thinking cap on, and let's start. So let's review what we did in the last module. We looked at how to understand and analyze graphs, charts, and tables. And we'll be using the things that we learned in module 3 in this module. So if you didn't look at the last module, go back and have a look at module 3 before beginning this module. So why should you plan? Lots of people tell me that they don't have time to plan in Task 1. They say Task 1 is only 20 minutes. And they always run over time. They always spend 25 minutes or 30 minutes planning, or sorry, not 30 minutes planning, 30 minutes writing their essay. You should only spend 20 minutes or less writing your Task 1 essay. So I understand why people don't want to plan, but the main reason why you should plan is it does actually save you time. Most students that I teach, when they start planning, they all tell me it actually does save them time. They get their Task 1 finished in 20 minutes or less. The reason is, if you know what to write, writing will be quick. So you will write far faster when you have a plan, when you know exactly what to write. So the writing stage is much faster. Task 1 is a thinking task and a writing task. So the examiner is looking for you to demonstrate that you can understand the data, that you can analyze the data, that you can pick out the main features and then write about them. So at least 20 to 30% of the task is just thinking about the data and then writing about it. And we do most of our thinking in the planning stage. So if you start writing without planning, then it's very difficult to think and write at the same time. So what we do is we do all our thinking first and then we start writing. You will also make fewer mistakes, and because you're not writing and thinking at the same time, you're just focusing on writing, then you will obviously make less mistakes because you're focusing on just one thing. So you'll make fewer grammar mistakes, you'll make fewer vocabulary mistakes, and you will also make fewer data mistakes and fewer idea mistakes, and you won't get stuck. The main reason why people run out of time or don't get their Task 1 finished in 20 minutes is they write one sentence and then they have to think about it for a while and think about what they're going to write next, so they get stuck. If you plan everything and then you start writing, you just write continuously. You don't get stuck. You don't have to think about anything, so it's much easier. So please try and plan your essay for at least 5 minutes. Every single student that I have taught who has got a band 8 or a band 9, the one thing they have in common is they all plan their answers. So there are 4 stages to planning. The first stage is understanding the graph. We did this in module 3. The next stage is identifying the key features. We're going to do that in this module. We also need to identify any comparisons. And then we add this information to a structure that we have memorized. And we're going to look at that structure in this module. So let's look at how to understand the graph one more time. Let's just revise what we learned in Module 3, plus a few extra things that you have to think about. So this is the first part of your planning stage, and you don't have to write anything down if you don't want to. If you want to write some things down, fine, but most of these things are just thinking. They are just sitting there looking at the question and thinking about this. And a good way to do it is just to ask yourself several questions. So these are some of the questions that you should ask yourself. What type of graph is it? So you will instantly recognize the type of graph. What does the title say? What does it say on the x-axis, and what does it say on the y-axis? What is the measurement? So what is the unit of measurement? Is it percent? Is it a number of people? What kind of data is it that they are showing you? What are the items, and is there a key? So what are the, say there are 4 lines. What does each line represent? Is there a key that is showing you what each line represents? Are you sure about this? So let's look at more questions that you would have to think about. You'd have to think about how many items are there. If there are 2 graphs, how many items are there in graph 1, and how many items are there in graph 2? Is it over time or not? So does it begin in the past, say 100 years ago or 50 years ago, and does it run up to the future? If it is over time, that is going to affect your answer. What tenses will you have to use? So is the data from the past, present, or is it a projection into the future? What is the purpose of the graph? Is it to show general trends, or is it to compare and contrast things? And this is very important. We looked at this in Module 3. So by asking yourself all of these questions, you will be able to fully understand the graph. So you don't have to write anything down, but until you think about all of these things, you shouldn't start your question. So that's the first stage of planning. Then we go on to the next stage of planning. So next we're going to move on to structure. So we're going to look at the 4-paragraph structure that I use for every Task 1 question. The question always states the same thing. It always says summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and making comparisons where relevant. And this is very good for us because we can use the same structure for every question. So the data will be different and the question will be slightly different, but this never changes. The bit in red never changes. So that means we can confidently use the same structure again and again and again. So this is our Task 1 structure. Each number represents a paragraph. So first paragraph is your introduction. Then you skip a line. Your second paragraph will be your overview. And then your third paragraph will be your first details paragraph, where you get into more detail. And then you skip a line, and the fourth paragraph is your second details paragraph. We're going to have a full module in the next module, Module 5, on how to write an introduction and how to write an overview. And then Module 6, we're going to look in detail at how to write the details paragraphs. But before we do that, just in case people don't really know what these are, we're going to briefly look at each one of them. So the paragraph 1 is our introduction. So imagine we get this question here. The chart below shows the number of men and women in further education in Britain in 3 periods and whether they were studying full-time or part-time. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. So as I said before, this bit never changes. However, this bit is our question. Okay, this is our question statement. So all the introduction is we simply paraphrase the bit that I've just highlighted here, the question statement. And we paraphrase this simply by writing it again, but in different words so that it has the same meaning. And we're going to look at how to do that in much more detail in the next module. Paragraph 2 is our overview. This is where we pick 2, 3, or 4 key features and report them generally. And generally means that we don't report any data. Data is too specific, and we leave that until the details paragraphs. So in the overview, we just pick out the 2 to 4 most important things or the most obvious things, and we report them in a very general way. And we're going to look at how to do that in much more detail in the next module. So if we were going to pick out some very general things about this graph, what would we pick out? So let's look at the burglary. So if we look at from the starting point to the end point, so this bit here, so the big picture is that burglary is decreasing. If we look at robbery, it stays basically the same. So it stays relatively stable. So the big picture for robbery is that it stays relatively stable. So you would include that in your overview. If we were to look at car theft, so from 2003 to 2012, it increases. So we're looking at the big picture and it goes from here to here so that it increases. So that is all you would have to do for that graph. Burglary goes down, car theft goes up, and robbery stays the same. Those are the three most obvious things about that graph, and you wouldn't include any data. So the details paragraph. This is where you report the key features in more detail. So you get into much more detail in the details paragraphs. So if we look at burglary, let's concentrate on burglary. So for the overview, we were just looking at from this point to this point, and it went down. We're just giving the general overview. However, in the details paragraph, we need to look at what happens between here and here, what happens between, say, here and here, and then what happens between here and here. So there are, in the overview, there is just one stage from 2003 to 2012, but in the details paragraphs, we get into much more detail in smaller stages like this. So let's move on to identifying key features. The biggest mistakes students make is overcomplicating these. The number one thing that students do is they make their job more complicated, more complex than it really needs to be. The things that you're looking for are often the most obvious things. Students think that IELTS is very, very difficult, therefore that the answers to the question must be difficult, they must be complicated, the answers must be complex. In Task 1, the key features will be the easiest things to spot. And for some reason, students find this very difficult to understand. So I'm going to demonstrate to you with lots of examples later how you shouldn't overcomplicate these and how they are the easiest things to understand. The examiner knows that you have never seen the graph before and that you are not an expert in this field. So think about the last graph that we looked at. That was about crime in Manchester. The examiner knows that you've never been to Manchester. The examiner knows that you might have never studied criminology or know anything about crime, and they know that this is the first time you've ever seen the graph and you only have 20 minutes. So they're not expecting you to have a very, very complicated answer. In the last question, it would just be one goes up, one goes down, and one stays the same. That's all the examiners are expecting. So the biggest mistake teachers make is simply telling students to look out for things like these. So I've watched lots of teachers teach IELTS Task 1, and when it comes to identifying key features, the teacher just stands at the front of the room and says, look out for these things, look out for the biggest thing, the smallest thing, the biggest changes, the biggest differences, the biggest trends, the biggest comparisons. And I did this too. When I first started teaching IELTS many years ago, I told my students this. And what happened was, after the class, I would give them homework, and the homework would be just look at a graph and identify the main features. And if there was 16 people in the class, I would get 16 different answers. So obviously I had failed as a teacher. If my students are failing, that means I am failing. I'm not teaching them properly. So there needs to be a better way of teaching people how to identify key features. The problem with just telling students to look out for the biggest, the smallest, the biggest differences, etc., is that it does not allow any flexibility, and it treats all graphs the same. it is telling students that every question is going to be the same. All the data is going to be the same. You just have to look for the biggest and the smallest. That means that students do not look at each graph on its own merits, and they just pick out the things that they think might be correct, but most of the time they're not. So let's look at this. This is a very good example. If you were looking for the biggest, say you would say, burglary was the biggest in 2004 and the lowest was robbery, but car theft became the biggest in 2007. So if you included those three things in your overview for this, it would be wrong. The examiner is not looking for which one was the biggest in 2004 and which one was the biggest after 2008 and which one was the smallest. Because this is a graph over time, what they are looking for is simply the general trends. So burglary goes down, car theft goes up, robbery stays the same. Those are the three simple things. But if you looked at this list, these things here, most students would just look at this graph and interpret it the way that I told you at the start, and that would be wrong. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at several different graphs, pie charts, bar charts, line graphs, multiple graphs, and I am going to pick out the key features that you would include in your overview. So for this one, the first thing I would notice about this one is it is a graph over time. It is a bar chart over time, so from 2002 to 2010. So what I'm looking for here, if it's over time, is general trends. You always look for general trends with bar graphs or line graphs that go over time. So what I do is I just put my pencil or pen at the start and I trace it up to the end. And what happens is you'll see that's a steady increase. The next thing I would do is I would look at this. So this is 2002 and 2010, and it is divided into level of education. So the lowest level of education here up to the highest level of education here. And I would plot a line from here up to here, and here up to here. And because the graph is going from least amount of education up to most, then I can quickly decide, sorry, my drawing of arrows isn't very good, I can quickly see that the higher the education goes, the higher the computer ownership goes. And this is both the same for 2002 and 2010, relatively the same. And remember that we're not getting into any detail here. So the key features are two general trends. One is a general trend over time. The first one, there was a significant rise in the percentage of the population that owned a computer. So from the first date to the last date, it increased. And the second one was the higher the level of education, the more likely they are to own a computer. So let's look at some mistakes that students would possibly make on this question. For your overview, one of the biggest mistakes that students would make would be to try to compare these groups. So they would start talking about the difference between high school diploma and college, and the difference between college and postgraduate. That is getting into too much detail, and obviously you would have to talk about more than 4 things. Remember that the key features that you include in your overview will only have between 2 and 4 features in it, 2 and 4 things. So let's look at this graph. So the first thing I notice about this graph is that it's over time. However, it is not years or months or weeks, it is just time of the day or night. So it is just a 24-hour period from 6 a.m. to the next 6 a.m. And there are only 2 things. There is television and there is radio. So because it's just over a 24-hour period, the most obvious thing we need to look for is, for television, when is it used the most? And for radio, when is radio used the most? So we can see here that television is used the most in the evening, so between say 6 and about midnight. For radio, we can see that radio is used in the morning, so between say 7 a.m. and 12 noon. So those are two key features of this graph. The next thing that we might look for is, because there are only two items, television and radio, we can compare these. So which one is used the most? So we can see just by looking at the whole data that television is used much more than radio. So our three key features are this: watching TV is highest in the evening, listening to radio highest in the morning, and overall more people watch TV. So it's one highest and lowest and one comparison, so three things. So let's look at some common mistakes that people make. The biggest mistake that people make on this question is they see that it's over time, so they start looking for general trends. So they would say people don't watch TV very much in the morning, and then it starts to peak at around 2, and it peaks at around 8 p.m, and then it falls down sharply to 2 a.m, and then remains relatively stable. So you'll notice that there are 1, 2, 3, 4 things just for television. So already we've broken the rule of between 2 and 4 things. So that means there are too many things that we describe in our overview. So it's fine to describe these things in our details paragraph, but for our overview, we can't do that. Similarly, people might say radio peaks from 6 a.m. up to 8 p.m. and then there is a steady decrease until 6 a.m. the following morning. This is two things. So if you added these two things to the 4 things that you would talk about television, that's 6 things altogether, 6 elements. So it's just too much. So we wouldn't describe the general trends for this one because it's just one day. So next we're going to look at a bar chart. And the first thing you'll notice about this bar chart is it's over time. So we're going to be looking for general trends. And then we'd look at full-time and part-time. And it's divided into female and male. So if we start with full-time education, we would plot here to here, so the start date to the end date. It goes up. For women, for full-time, it goes up. So that's our first general trend. For full-time education, both men and women, it goes up. Let's look at females. For part-time, it doesn't just go up, it increases dramatically or significantly. And for men, it fluctuates, so it goes down and then it goes up a little bit. So our 3 general trends would be: overall the number of men and women in full-time education increased, women in part-time education increased significantly, and men in part-time education fluctuated. Let's look at some mistakes that students would make. The biggest mistake students would make would be getting into too much detail between the years. So they would start saying between 1970 and 81 it increased, and then between 81 and 91 it increased again. So for women, they would discuss this and then they would discuss this instead of just discussing the overall trend. Because if you discuss this, then 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 this, and then this, and this, there are just too many elements. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 things. So if you include 8 things in your overview, then you're not really giving an overview. You're getting into too much detail. Of course, you can discuss these things in more detail in the details paragraph, but for the overview, you're just looking for the most general things. So now let's look at pie charts. Now this is quite an interesting pie chart because there are 2 countries, Italy and Yemen, and there are also 2 years. So we don't really know whether we should make a comparison or whether we should show the general trends. And the next thing you would need to look at is the years. So 0 to 14 years, 15 to 59 years, and 60 plus years. So you can see that unless you look at each piece of information, so the countries, the dates, and the key below, you won't really you won't really understand the graph, and you won't know the purpose of the graph and therefore what the key features are. So the purpose of this graph is two things. It's to compare Yemen and Italy. So we have two countries, so therefore they want to compare them. This is why the person who made these pie charts, this is why they're doing it. And they want to compare dates. So they want to compare 2000 and 2050. And here, again, 2000 and 2050. So the first thing I would do is try and find a general trend for Yemen and Italy. So if we look at Yemen and Italy, we can notice that in Yemen there are a higher proportion of younger people, so 0 to 14 and 15 to 59 in both Yemen for 2000 and 2050 than Italy in 2000 and 2050. So overall, Yemen has the younger population for both dates. Then we would compare 2000 and 2050 for both, and for both Yemen and Italy it is predicted that between 2000 and 2050 the populations will get older, so for Yemen and for Italy. So our two things is one comparison and one general trend over time. It is clear that Yemen had the younger population in the year 2000, and the same is predicted for 2050. The populations of both countries are predicted to get older over the 50-year period. So I've made one comparison. Here is the comparison between the two countries, and one general trend for both countries. Now let's look at the mistakes that students would make when trying to find the key features. The biggest mistake students would make would be commenting on each individual age bracket. So instead of just saying people generally get older, they would start commenting on the differences between individual years. So they would say half of the people in Yemen in 2000 were between 0 and 14 years, and only just over 14% were in Italy in 2000. So that's just getting into too much detail. If you find yourself commenting on percentages or specific categories, then you are getting into too much detail, and those are not the key features that you need to include in your overview. Alright, let's look at a table. So this is the one that students don't really like because there's so much information. So it's difficult to pick out key features when there is so much information. When you get lots of information like this, don't focus on any of the numbers. Just look at generally what is happening. What are the big trends? So there are two categories, coffee and bananas, and there are 2 years, 99 and 2004. So what you would do is you would look for any general trends between 1999 and 2004, because two dates, so we need to see is anything going up or going down. What's the general trend? So we can see here increase, 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 increase. So our first general trend is for coffee. It increases between 1999 and 2004. The purpose of this is to show the difference between 1999 and 2004. Again, purpose of this is to show the difference between 1999 and 2004 for bananas. So increase, 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 slight decrease, and slight decrease. So our second general trend is most countries. So there's 3 out of 5. Most countries for bananas, they also increased. So there's two general trends for the table. Coffee increased in all 5 countries, and sales of banana only went up in 3 out of 5 countries. Or you could just say sales of bananas went up in most countries. Very, very general not getting into too much detail. And the biggest mistake students would make would be getting lost in the numbers, talking about the data. You don't include any data in your overview. They are not the key features. Now let's look at two different graphs. So here is a pie chart and here is a table. Again, lots and lots of information. What we need to do is just find the most general things about each graph. When we get two different data sources, there will always be one general thing, one key feature from each. So you won't just mention key features from one and not the other. So what we need to usually do is find one or two key features from the first one and one or two key features from the second one. So the most overall thing that I can see in the pie chart here is there are three main causes of land degradation. These are the causes. There are three main ones, and overgrazing is the most significant. Then if we look at causes of land degradation, we can see that there are three main causes. Because this is our overview, we're looking for key features for our overview, we're not going to include three different things. So we can't talk about any of this. Okay, there's just too much information here and we're not going to talk about that. What we need to do is look at this and see if there is any significant information here. And the most significant information here is Europe has much more land degraded than North America and Oceania. So the two main features, the two key features are, there are three main reasons why farmland becomes degraded, and overgrazing is the main one. The table shows that Europe had a far higher proportion of unproductive land than Oceania or North America. So there are three things there. Three things are three main reasons. Overgrazing is the main one. Europe had a far higher proportion than the other two. So the problems that students would get would be comparing these. So there are three things, so it's too much. And comparing these. So that would mean that you were discussing between 3 and 7 things if you talked about this as well. So you wouldn't say overgrazing is highest and then deforestation is second and then overcultivation is third. That's too many things for one graph. And then you wouldn't start talking about these 3 things because there's just too much. That would be the biggest mistake, just talking about too many things in your overview. Remember, for 2 graphs, there should be 1 or 2 from one and 1 or 2 from the other. So I hope by going through each of those examples with you and showing you how I think about each of them, that has made it much clearer and much easier for you to pick out your key features and include them in an overview. I think that's a much better way of showing you than just say, look for the highest and look for the lowest. But let's review the key lessons that we learned from looking at those examples. Don't get into detail. So there shouldn't be any detail. There shouldn't be any facts or any data in your overview. So you don't look at detail for the key features. Look for the most obvious thing. If you think about the first graph we looked at about crime, just one went up, one went down, one stayed the same. That was the most obvious thing about that. If you think about the computer ownership example, just over time it went up, and the more education someone had, the more likely they were to own a computer. Very, very obvious. If there's more than 4 elements, then it is probably wrong. So if you're talking about more than 4 things, then it is wrong. Look at the big picture. So look at what is happening overall. It is called an overview. What is happening on a big scale, not looking at details. Don't overcomplicate it. If it seems easy or obvious, then you have the right answer. So if you looked at a graph and just one goes up, one goes down, and one fluctuates, and you think, oh, this is too easy, there must be other things that I need to find. It's not. It's the easiest thing is probably the key features. It's probably the right answer. Look for general trends if over time. So if it's over time from one date to the next date, then always look for the general trends. And think about the purpose. Why did the person making this graph make it? Think about the pie charts example. The person who made that pie chart wanted to show you the difference between Italy and Yemen and their projections for the future. So you're going to include both of those things in your overview. There's going to be at least one key feature about the difference between Yemen and Italy, and one key feature between the difference between 2000 and 2050. So let's review what we did in this module. Why we should plan, how to plan, the simple 4-paragraph structure that I use, and we're going to be looking at that in much more detail in the next 2 modules. How to identify key features that we need to include in our overview. Then we looked at lots of examples, and we looked at key lessons that you need to think about when finding key features for your overview when you're writing your own questions. So in the next module, we're going to look in lots of detail about how to write an effective introduction and how to take our key features and include them in our overview. So I hope you enjoyed that lesson. I hope you found it useful. Thank you very much. Goodbye.